Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this Aura webinar. My name is Suzanne Luchtart. I'm one of the people who runs Aura and organises events like these for our members. And by day, like most of you, I work client-side in research. This is our very first Aura webinar, and we've introduced them for a number of reasons. One is to just give us another platform where we can share more widely the amazing content and speakers that we see at our regular seminars and conference. But the other is to celebrate and hear from the agencies and practitioners that Aura members love working with. I don't think you get much more love than Incite, actually. They've just been named Aura's Agency of the Year for the second year in a row. So it's with huge pleasure that I'm welcoming Stefan Schafer to the webinar. Hi, Stefan. Stefan's a director at Incite and is going to give us his perspectives on Agile Insight and share with us some of the tools and techniques that we can all use every day to inspire us to be more effective. Stefan, you're going to be talking for about half an hour, and we hope to have some time at the end for questions. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to just put them in through the Q&A box on the Zoom platform, and we'll pick up as many of those as we can at the end. So Stefan, thank you so much for joining us today, and I'll hand everything over to you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Well, good afternoon, everybody. As Suzanne says, we'll take questions at the end, but I'll try and make sure we get through the material in a nice, speedy way, so we leave a bit of time for that. First thing I'll just do briefly is just introduce us as an agency, and I think that will give some useful context to what I'll be talking about. There's a lovely big picture of me there, in case that's helpful. This is what I look like. As Suzanne said, I work at Incite. And we call ourselves a strategic research consultancy. So we do full service market research, but also we're based here in London, which is where you find me today. We're a mix of qual and quant work, but also standalone consultancy work. And we tend to work, hence the description, on more foundational pieces of research. So strategic questions and I suppose more complicated questions. And for that reason, Agile is particularly interesting to us because I think the default for those kinds of projects, or certainly historically, has been ponderous, expensive, slow, and all of those things are becoming more difficult to justify nowadays. And we think that Agile is a way to avoid some of the problems or the delays or the costly processes that can often seem like they're part and parcel of important bits of work. We think they don't need to be, and we're going to talk today about one way in which you can work in a more agile way, even when the questions you're addressing are big, chunky, and important. The other reason that Agile has become particularly interesting for us is we're part of a wider marketing services group called Kin + Carter. And we are part of what's called the Strategy and Insight pillar within that group, along with a couple of other consumer and, in the case of Hive, healthcare specialist agencies. But the bulk of the group as a whole works in digital spaces. So we have web design, SEO, technology, and that tends to mean app development work. And it means that a lot of the time when we're working with our partners in those other businesses, they are using approaches like Agile, they're using ways of working which we've learned a huge amount from. And I think as digital becomes a bigger part of our world as an agency, and I'm sure as marketeers, understanding how to get the best from ways of working and how to work effectively with teams that work in that way also becomes an important skill to have. So 4 things I will discuss today. We'll give a little bit of background on what Agile is, and I'm sure that will be familiar to many of you, but hopefully it'll be a useful grounding in the way that we think about it, and we'll set up then what we discuss in a moment in terms of more practical elements of that. And in particular, we're going to focus on the first stages of a research or a marketing consultancy process or brief, and looking at 4 tools to help prioritize, sharpen, and focus the way in which you set up projects in order to deliver agile working and facilitate agile working throughout the project as a whole. And we'll talk a little bit about why we think that's an especially important. In a nutshell, the thought is that it's much easier to start in the right way than it is to course correct. A project which is set up and scoped in an efficient, agile, focused way will be far easier to then run in an efficient, agile, focused way. So I'll be talking through, as I say, 4 specific tools that we use, and we would be happy for you to steal and use yourselves for bringing that about. So under an introduction to what we mean by agile. And I'm sure, as many of you know, this is a term that originally comes from software development. And as a consequence, we believe that it's not a set of principles or beliefs that can be directly copy-pasted into the worlds that we operate in, that they can be fairly directly inspirational to the ways in which we work. So there is an official definition, even in fact an official manifesto for agile working, which was put together, I believe, in the late 90s by software developers. And it was developed as a to the more traditional ways in which software was being developed at that time that manifesto talked about. It talked about emphasizing individuals and interactions over processes. It talked about the importance of working towards working software. So having something that does the job right now is more important than comprehensive documentation on the route. Customer collaboration was a big part of it. So again, this was written from the point of view of agencies or software development teams working with stakeholders or clients, but the underlying thought there is that close collaboration and discussion with whoever it is you're developing is far more important than tightly negotiating every single line, because that ties both parties down to something that may then turn out not to be right. And linked to that, the 4th principle in that manifesto was around responsiveness to change. So being open to the possibility that where you're going and how you're going to get there will and should develop and evolve over the course of an engagement rather than be set in stone at the beginning. So there's lots of interesting principles in there. Some of them make direct reference to software development, which I would assume that most of us on the call today are not engaged in. So one of the tasks we have to do is how we translate that into the work that we do. And it's certainly the case that that's happening whether or not we do that in a clear way anyway. You know, this is a selection of quotes from... So what I was saying is that Agile as a term has become very popular, let's say, amongst a number of different organizations that we've worked with and which I'm sure others have worked with on this call as well or worked alongside. And often it can mean we will do things quicker or more cost effectively. But we suspect that there's more to what Agile can deliver than is being captured in that thought. And there are a number of useful principles that we want to codify and make use of. Working at pace is certainly part of it, and making sure that we don't let the perfect solution be the enemy of a good solution considerably quicker. And we often talk in terms of speed to value, and that's a central part of the way in which Agile is deployed by a lot of organizations, the idea that is better than the perfect answer after a very long time. But some of the other principles, we want this idea of collaboration being team-led. It's around an iterative process, so trying to make use of that idea of collaboration as well as that idea of reaching an answer and a process through the course of a project rather than being tied to a plan that's written on day. Useful thoughts around visual frameworks and building a common picture of the world as a way to navigate your challenges, specific examples of that in a moment. And finally, the idea that Agile in some ways actually requires considerably more to what you will do and how you will do it. Although you're not tied to a plan, there is certainly a need for accountability and discipline in the way in which it is done. And what we're trying to avoid here is an issue that we have seen, I think, of good marketing principles, which is that small 1 or 2 lines of good thinking become all that's remembered and used. So How Brands Grow talks about a lot more than simply targeting penetration, but that's the thought that gets remembered. And the same is true for the other 2 books here on screen. And we believe the risk, if not properly managed and thought about as a way of working, it becomes similar to Monty Python's 100-yard dash for people with no sense of direction. It's a very quick way to get to bad answers and to waste money rather than a quick way to get to a useful answer. So The first step here is, we think, centrally important. What you see on screen here is an outline of the process, the consulting process we go through with our clients, that starts by interrogating their brief. And as I mentioned at the start, it's cheaper, more effective, and psychologically easier to work in an agile way and to work in a way which is effective and efficient and focused if you set that up properly at the beginning, which is why what we'll be talking about today is ways in which you can do that. And there are lots of reasons why it's tricky to do that. Firstly, there's probably a norm or a default within a lot of organizations that spending additional time at the start of projects isn't what a general preference people have as consumers, as colleagues, as human beings out there in the world, for paying later rather than paying now. There is an impetus at the beginning of projects to say, right, let's get cracking. And it can be challenging to say to colleagues, to stakeholders, to partners, no, we need to pause and wait and scope this thing properly. And the third element, we believe, is the issue of self-efficacy, the idea that without a clear plan for how you would set up a project for agile working, it's even more psychologically difficult to do it. So in a way, the things we'll be talking about on this call are about tackling number 3 in order to give you the collateral, give you the ammunition to go and tackle numbers 1 and 2. So those 4 tools I'll be talking about, they relate, as I say, all to the beginning of projects. So we'll talk about a particular way to approach kickoff meetings at the beginning of projects. We'll talk about what we call objection handlers, which is ways in which to make sure you get the right people in the room. 2 tools for scoping core questions, and a second is what we call issue trees. The first of those then, Agile Kickoffs, for those of you who are Aura members, there will be a pack that will be shared via Aura that gives you some of these plans as a takeaway in a PDF. Give you the outline structure. There are 2 things here. One is the meeting agenda, which is on the right there, and on the left is a template for capturing what the objectives of the project are. And I won't read out every single word there, but instead the thing I'd like to highlight is 3 core questions or key questions that need to be asked in order to make sense of what is happening in a project, what needs to happen in a project, and where it sits in relation to everything else. Often briefs we will see from our clients, and I'm sure briefs you will see from your stakeholders, will start somewhere in the middle of that challenge sheet. They'll talk about the specifics of a planning challenge, so what it is we're trying to achieve as marketeers. And there are a number of prompts there to help you make sure you get sufficient detail. And often as researchers or as agencies, we're good at then translating that into the considerations for a project, so the factors that need to be considered, what the scope is, which markets are involved, which audiences, all of that stuff. But on the far left-hand side of that, the situation, the relevant context, that often is central to getting a really sharp expression of the type of solution or the type of outcome that's needed. So we'll talk in a moment about core questions, but often the information that comes under that wider business context is really central to doing that effectively. And on the right-hand side of this, there is a suggested agenda, and it's deliberately short. It's an hour long. It need not be any longer than that. And I think certainly a phenomenon we see internally when we're not at our best and not using an agenda like this is kickoff sessions for projects, kickoff sessions for really any endeavor can be an opportunity for people to sort of air their thoughts and hypotheses unstructured and undirected. And really that's exactly what we're trying to avoid if agile working is the objective. So there is a series of suggestions there around how you pre-plan, what do they need to know as they enter the room, and then 3 distinct steps that we would walk people through and suggest you walk people through within the session itself to first state, iterate and agree the core question and how that will be unpacked. 2, if you're working with an agency or a partner, that will be a proposal that's on the table from them, but should never be taken as the final word on what needs to be done. Logistics, who will do what next, when. So really quite basic stuff, but if managed and facilitated efficiently, you can get an awful lot more done if you use this kind of approach within an hour than 3 hours in a more discursive session. The second point, though, is this is all well and good, but it does rely on having the right people in the room. What we have here are 6 examples of feedback or objections you may receive from stakeholders or colleagues, reasons why I can't attend what you've told me is an important kickoff session. And I'm sure some of these will be familiar from your own work. So people saying, I've written down what I need for you, therefore I don't need to be in the room. Or we just need to get going, we don't need to be talking about it again. The specifics of what those objections are, and indeed the specifics of how you handle them, are likely to be particular to your organization or to the people you're dealing with. Really, the key thing here is to consider ahead of time what they might be and give some thought to how you might handle them, because all of these have, I think, reasonable answers. And there are 2 broad ways in which we would suggest you tackle them. One is this idea of hyperbolic discounting that I briefly mentioned earlier on, the idea that we need to dramatize the risk associated with making poor decisions up front, because people are inclined to not worry about things until they absolutely have to. So framing that discussion in terms of what behavioral economists would call the scarcity heuristic, the idea that this is your one and only chance to shape what will happen, can be a very powerful, even if you only get 50 minutes from a particularly senior and hard to pin down stakeholder, you do at least get those 15 minutes, and you impress upon her that it is important that those 15 minutes are spent now rather than at the end of a project when really their ability to shape it will be long past. And then the second, which is probably a little bit less sort of dauntingly confrontational, is building new cultural norms. We talked about one of the issues being that people simply don't expect this to happen at the start of a project. Building artifacts, and some of the things we've shown you there already, the challenge definition sheet and the agenda for the kickoff, they demonstrate that this is how things are done now. They demonstrate that this is a thing with a capital T, and they trigger the idea that some effort and thought has gone into this, that therefore it has value. And I think returning to that idea throughout the consulting process and throughout the project process can be really powerful to people, that there is value in this and they ought to be involved. So talk about are quite closely linked to each other, and they're about setting the right question and then unpacking it in the right way. And again, the relevance of this for agile working is that one of the most important ways in which you can work more quickly, more efficiently, with less expense is by identifying you need to know. All of the central objectives of a project are the things that slow projects down, as much as habit, as much as any other element. So we start with a fairly general question that we as an agency would often see in a brief: how can we regain market share? Now, how that question might be sharpened up depends very strongly on what the ingoing situation is. So if you're a well-established player whose market share has fallen by 5% due to, you believe, a softening of consideration, that's one situation. A different situation, though, is that new, agile, nimble competitors have come in and taken that 5% directly. Rather than losing it in general, you have lost it to two specific competitors. And the way you might then specify the nuance of what you're trying to achieve would change accordingly. So the first may lead to a project scope and a core question to define that scope, which is all about targeting and messaging, whereas the second might be far more specifically focused on how we can fight back against competitor X or whoever it might be. And the importance of this is tied up to what I'm sure many of you have seen before, the idea of a smart question. So something which is specific, measurable, action-oriented, relevant, and time-bound. It really allows you to tie down exactly what you need to achieve, when you need to achieve it, what's in scope. And if you have a question which is formed in that way, it can lead to far clearer requirements in terms of the research, requirements in terms of the process as a whole. And really the critical skill here is in challenging. So if the question is vague, if the question is ill-defined, it tends to be due to one of three things. It tends to be due to unstated assumptions. You know, but without any supporting evidence behind it can be very dangerous at the start of projects. It can be about deflection. You know, it's not up to us to make those recommendations. That's always a warning sign that potentially you haven't iterated and interrogated that core question sufficiently. Or it can be about perceived inhibitors. We don't have time, we don't have access, we don't have the money. All of those considerations are real and important, but they should be surfaced, discussed, and taken into account. So it may very well be the case that you have to make some assumptions, but until you surface them and agree that they are assumptions, you're far more at risk to not being able to respond if those assumptions turn out to be false. And is a tool we use a lot internally, which is called the issue tree, which is a way of breaking out a smart core question into more manageable chunks, which can be addressed with specific bits of analysis or data collection. So what you're looking to do is identify all the sub-questions that would need to that higher order core question, that key business question that you've identified. And the way you might break that down will very much depend on the situation. So there are some example detail. I'll just show you some worked ideas instead. So if your core question was how can we most XXX to regain lost share, your issue tree, your first level below that might be what's the optimal product proposition, who is our target market, and what's the most compelling positioning for that product. So breaking out the different elements of the marketing plan in that case. Or it might be about, in this case, important variables for us to perform well on, how well do we currently perform, and where do we need to target our efforts to improve. Or similarly, it might be broken out in terms of where your revenue sources might come from. So how can credit card X grow? Well, it might be by choice or by driving revolve balances. And the idea here is that you layer by layer until you're at a sufficiently granular question that you can identify the work required. And the value of this is that it means that you can identify exactly what you know, what you don't know, what you need to know, and what you can afford not to know. By looking across this, you will know that collectively that will be sufficient information and nothing else is needed. So a worked example here, slightly silly one, but if your personal amount of cash over the next 12 months by 25%, your first layer might be, what can I do to increase my incomings and what can I do to decrease my spending? And then you would break that out. And on the left-hand side, I can increase my salary. Can I get a pay rise? And your work required would be speak to your boss. And that principle of carrying through this questioning until you reach a specific action or a way to answer the question is exactly what's guiding the use of this in research or in consultancy. So taken together, the point of these four tools really is to lead to time savings and lead to more effective and efficient work further down the line. So a number of ways in which that helps. Firstly, definition. It gives you a simple logical picture of what's needed and what is not needed, so that avoids confusion and dead ends. It also identifies gaps. What do you know already don't know can be collected and nothing else need be collected. It also has a very powerful tool for aligning stakeholders. If they can see via your core question, via the process of the kickoff workshop, via the issue tree. And similarly, it can be a signpost for the write-up. It tends that issue trees are a pretty good starting point for presentations. They're a good way to structure thinking in your presentation of findings as well. And finally, it's a useful navigation tool. If you find that maybe some things you took to be assumptions and said, well, we won't research that further, we know that already. If new evidence comes to light, it can demonstrate how the whole thing needs to change in order to accommodate that. And similarly, if what's in and out of scope changes, it gives you a way to navigate that change and document that change in a very visual and collaborative way. Okay, so just coming up to the half an hour mark, I'll wrap up and then we'll go to questions. I believe there have been some further problems with the connection, so I'm very sorry about that. I hope those of you who have stuck around have been able to follow most of it. And if not, please do get in touch. We'd be happy to share the material. So, as we said at the start, Agile Insights are a challenge to us all to work differently, but we also think they're an opportunity for us all to work smarter. And that means being braver, so not starting a project until you've got a challenged and specified brief, which is detailed enough that you can work efficiently in an agile way. It challenges us to be collaborative. All of this requires ongoing and detailed conversation between everyone who's delivering and using the work. Of course, it requires us to be faster, but it also requires us to be open to learning from every engagement, to finding what works best for our organizations and how it can be best used for future projects. So we've talked about how Agile is becoming ubiquitous as a catchphrase, but can be misunderstood, and it's not straightforward to apply it. But we think that using the ideas and tools we've discussed today, making sure that projects and work streams are kicked off effectively, that there's prioritization of what you will do and how you will do it, and it's done in deep collaboration with the people who are delivering the work, can facilitate the delivery of Agile work far more effectively than really at any other stage of the process. So hopefully you'll be able to make use of some of the ideas we've discussed here. And as I say, some of the handouts will be available via the Aura website for those of you who are members. And in terms of what's next for Incite, we'll be talking some more about the research part of the process, the actual data collection and analysis part of the process in one of our own seminars coming up at the end of June and the start of July. So if you're interested, please do get in touch. And there is a calendar of webinars which Aura have arranged with some of their award-winning agencies, which will be continuing through the summer. So thank you for your time. I will now see what questions we have, and I will try to operate the software that will tell me that to the best of my ability.
Yeah, we've got, thanks, Stefan. That was super interesting, and so many practical things that we can all take away and use, particularly with that pack that you talked about that's going to be on the Aura website. A couple of questions coming through. So someone was asking if there are any particular research methodologies that lend themselves better to being used in an Agile way?
Yeah, I can see that question up here. I think they also make the point that quant studies, for example, can take a long time, and I think that's a fair challenge. I think one of the distinctions that we find useful is there is a difference between work which takes a long time to set up and then work which takes a long time to deliver. So it's certainly the case that a lot of sort of dyed-in-the-wool Agile or sprint-based methodologies will often use very light touch and often actually quite low-tech qual research as a way to get quick feedback. You know, if you think about things like the Google Sprint methodology, they advocate doing 5 in-depth interviews, so 5 qual interviews, and make the point that often you will have learned 80% of all you will ever learn from those initial engagements, and that often is a useful way to do it. But similarly, if the immediacy or the agile requirement for the research is one which comes from needing a quick turnaround once inputs are ready, a lot of that can be set up in advance. And there are a number of partners we work with who can turn around the actual fieldwork in a day or two. And if you scoped out what do we need to ask ahead of time, and you've identified what we will do with that ahead of time through the processes we've talked about before, you can then move very quickly in a couple of days, literally, to say, well, we knew that the 5 important questions and facts were going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, A, B, C, D, E. And therefore, we can very quickly tell you what we're going to do, precisely because you structured it ahead of time. We will talk a little bit more about research methodologies in that later session as well, but hopefully that's a useful sort of overview in the first instance.
There's another interesting question. I wonder if you've got a moment to answer it. So how can you make Agile working work in an organization where most people aren't working in that way? So kind of if Incite leads the way, but they're basically pushing against a cultural tide that doesn't work in that way. Have you got any ideas on how they could almost instill that new culture more widely?
Yes, I think in some ways, focusing on some of the maybe less scary elements of it in the first instance. So some of the things we've talked about here today in terms of setting up projects, I think are actually probably just good practice in a lot of contexts as well as in Agile working. And it needn't be the case that you require all of your stakeholders to change the way they work. But if you are filtering projects through a process that really clearly establishes objectives, really clearly establishes timelines which are aggressive, it's very unlikely you'll get pushback on that element of it. And it can mean that you as an Incite team and your partners can work in an Agile way that gels with the kind of requirements you're hearing from from your internal stakeholders without necessarily requiring them to do much more than turn up to the meetings we've organised and sold in a compelling way, hopefully.
We've got time for one more. There's an interesting question about laddering and how that compares with the issue tree approach.
Yeah, I'm just reading that. So the wider point being made is the issue tree seems to go down and down to a granular level. How does this relate to the technique of laddering, where you are re-clarifying what you really need? Is it complementary or more to do with getting stakeholder engagement? I think it's certainly a very similar approach, and actually we tend to work in that sort of top-down way, because we tend to find that just works better with, particularly when working with marketing stakeholders who will have a clear idea of where they need to get their brand to. And it's probably our skill and the internal insight team's skill to try and translate that through into work. But it's not uncommon, or it can also happen that we get a longer list of, here are lots of things we think are relevant, and then laddering those up to, therefore this should be the scope of the work, is really the same process and can be relevant in cases where the brief is maybe not as clear, or in cases where the brief has come from multiple stakeholders, so there isn't a single unifying thought there. And of course, laddering also has a lot of relevance at the back end of projects. So there's almost a process in reverse, where you're going from the insights and the facts collected to assembling a story and an answer to that core question, which would look far more similar to the technique of laddering, I think, at that point in the process.
Brilliant, thank you. I think we'll end it there for now. Again, on behalf of Stefan and Aura, apologies for the intermittent sound. I hope it wasn't too disruptive, and I know that most of you did actually stick with us all the way through, so thank you very much for that. As Stefan mentioned, there'll be some templates and packs available to Aura members on the website, and there'll also be a recording of this, so if you missed any of it, apart from obviously the intermittent sound issues, you can listen again through that. So just to really end by saying, on behalf of Aura and everyone that tuned in today, Stefan, enormous thank you for such an interesting presentation and for kickstarting our webinar series so brilliantly. If you enjoyed that, our next Aura webinar is on the 20th of June, when Strive will be sharing a really interesting case study looking at how the two extremes in our Insight toolbox, qualitative research and digital analytics, can marry together to help give us an understanding of how consumers really feel about artificial intelligence. So that's on Thursday the 20th at 12. We'll be investigating the technical issues and hopefully won't repeat those on then. But if you're interested in that one, you can sign up at the Aura website or through the various channels and LinkedIn. I hope you can join us for that one. Meanwhile, thank you everyone for joining, sticking with us, and to Stefan, hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you again at a Aura webinar or seminar sometime in the future.